Hello, my name's Lovelock. I'm a consulting director at Elevate Performance. I'm delighted today to be joined by one of our clients and my former boss, actually, Lisa. Lisa, over to you to kind of say hello and introduce yourself.
Hello, thanks, Carl. Yes, I'm Lisa Blewitt and I'm currently Director of Learning and Apprenticeships with BT Group.
Thanks, Lisa. So the reason that Lisa and I have carved out a bit of time together today is that we were fortunate enough to be appointed as BT's partner for a really important programme. The programme was called Leading Inclusively and Safely. And ultimately, we were working with some of the most senior leaders across BT Group to focus on how can we create a more inclusive environment through our leadership actions. Lisa, it's probably sensible to give you the floor to be able to just describe a little bit about the programme and what it was that you were setting out to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognise what a hot topic the whole, inclusion space is. I think the context for us was very much rooted in the transformational change. So we've got some really big ambitions, and I think at the heart of that, we recognise the real value of getting the very best out of all colleagues across the group. And so I think we recognised really early as we were exploring more and more about the transformation agenda and closer to home more and more about the inclusion strategy, actually what an integral part or a real enabler the inclusion space was going to be. And so our goal was never to say, we would perfect this by any stretch of the imagination. We knew we wouldn't nail it by doing one singular programme. I think what we wanted to do was provide a really solid foundation for all of our leaders to effectively see the world through different eyes. And so as we embark on that transformation journey, their leadership is flavoured very differently to what it would have been otherwise.
Thank you. And I remember feeling like at the beginning of the programme and the working together, it felt like we were trying to create something that people couldn't ignore. So rather than like a training programme or a learning programme or an exercise in education, like a bit of a disruption for people, so they recognised like their leadership responsibility and actually that this is really good leadership and it's a daily thing. It's not a thing that you switch on and off.
I think so. I mean, I'm a huge fan, Carl, that, leadership doesn't happen to the side. It's about the everyday moments, the moments that matter, and it's about the everyone. And so I think we recognised, and the link for us was about sort of saying, how do you galvanise the whole of your organisation behind transformational change and the really critical role that you have as a leader? When we talk about different leadership capabilities, you can go in many, many different spaces, like the commercial elements of it, the strategic elements, the customer elements. And actually, I think we started in this space because we said it starts with people, and it starts with all of your people and a really intentional and deliberate effort to show up differently for those people.
Yeah, and it certainly felt like that. And I know that you and your team had done a lot of research. You'd kind of really got under the skin of like, where were you to begin with? Sometimes when we start working with a client, there's a period of really getting under the skin of things in order to be able to understand where people are. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me at the beginning was our familiarization was essentially getting up to speed with what you'd already found out and what you'd established from people. When you started to unpick those things, what were some of the kind of key things, I guess, that elevated the status of this and made it, of all of the things that you could go for from a leadership capability perspective, like this the bet to back?
I think it definitely came from that piece. I mean, at one point we were looking at what were the key leadership behaviours, and of course they varied, like I say, between the strategic and the commercial aspects of leadership, the customer orientation. And inclusion was a hot topic at the time. We were coming off the back of, we had a new inclusion strategy. There was the murder of George Floyd. We'd done a lot in the race and ethnicity space, but we knew that we wanted to go broader and think about all facets of inclusion across the workspace. And you kind of go, it's a little bit like picking your favorite child, like where do you go first, if you like. And I think where we got to with inclusion was, does it even stand separately on its own? Because actually it flavors all of those things. And I think that's why we went there first, because actually it becomes like a real bedrock for how you then show up, like how do we get better customer products that are inclusive? How do we have better supplier relationships that, have that thread running through them? And then obviously the people agenda and how we drive performance and inclusion through that. So I think that's where it when we looked through all of the other things, we could see inclusion as a golden thread running throughout all of the different aspects of leadership, and that took us to that space first, I think.
Excellent. And I kind of, I guess my reflection when I think back about as we were approaching the design of the program, we'd had a number of conversations around how do we, I guess, almost bring that sense of responsibility that you've described and the golden thread. And I know that we'd said, well, we've got some of the most senior people in the business attending this program. We're going to ask them to lean in a topic that will require I guess a sense of vulnerability from them. How did that feel when we'd started to say this is an expectation that we're going to need, and we're going to need to ask people that in the past wouldn't have been, they probably wouldn't have received praise and applause for being vulnerable, but it was going to be essential for them to be able to move forward with this?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes really high stakes, doesn't it? And a little bit risky, in the sense of you can go very much down the tried and tested route, or you can take some risks, and it's, high risk, high return. And I think there was that aspect of how do we create something that is going to, in a space where leaders are overwhelmed by the everyday, like how do you create the space for people to be able to absorb this, really deeply reflect on it, but grab that attention, that they prioritize the time to be able to do that. And so I think, right from those early conversations, we knew we needed to create an experience. And I say that not just from a content perspective, but a real experience end to end that actually, they would see real value in carving the time out, and then real value for how it enables them to deliver performance into the organization and deliver a better experience for their people. And so, yeah, I think the design was very intentional to do that.
Yeah. And when you reflect and you think about what we then built together, and you think about I guess the kind of the experiences, were there any that stood out as the ones that felt like they really embodied that kind of almost like high stakes, that bit risk and reward in terms of this is different and it's a bit disruptive, but it will get the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two that really jump out to me, certainly the watch parties. I mean, we weren't really sure about them. I think we hadn't done anything particularly of that ilk before, and I think twofold. One, it was a completely new format for us, but I know, intentionally we saw those as real provocative moments, and so we intentionally dialed it up a notch in terms of the type of conversation we were wanting to have, the resources that we shared with people. They were intentionally a little bit prickly and pokey at points, and I think to drive that kind of thing. And then I think the accountability pods as well, just being able to sort of, I guess, step back from a learning and a HR perspective. We feel this huge obligation to manage and control everything and engineer every component of the experience. And I think the thing that we hear most often, it was risky at the time, but as we've gone through this experience, is leaders value the opportunity to have conversations with other leaders.
Yeah.
Like they want to be able to unpack what's going on for them. They want to be able to explore different ideas, hear different perspectives and different takes on it. And they really value that. I think that's a high risk though,
Yeah.
from a supplier creating a program and from us commissioning it, just to be able to step back and go, here's a little bit of guidance, here's a little bit of a framework, but go have a great conversation,
Yeah.
is risky for sure.
Yeah, and just for anybody that's listening to this and thinking, okay, that sounds interesting, but practically, what was it? So if you imagine that we'd had an 11-month program for leaders across the group, it started with some workshops. So they'd, I guess, kind of joined the program and they'd experienced facilitation as you would expect. Not traditional design, so we weren't heavy on models and theory. We were really trying to get to the nub of the emotion and to get people, I guess, a bit uncomfortable and a bit disrupted in order for them to be able to lead differently. As part of the early design process, we'd said that we wanted to shift away from everything being facilitated, because it feels like it's being done to some extent, no matter how well you do that. And we wanted people to start to kind of be in control of their own conversations. And that's where we ended up with this kind of premise of the watch party. So leaders would come together with no facilitator. They were introduced to a structure. It was signposted to them in an earlier workshop. They'd have a video to play. They'd be coming together, sometimes in person, but mainly virtually. They press play on the video. They'd watch the video. There'd be moments that they were instructed to pause, and there was just a really simple kind of conversation framework. And there was no one there to help them with their discomfort. And I think that's part of the beauty, right? It's like, okay, we've just seen something. Now there's a question for us to discuss, and no one's going to help us out in that moment. We need to find a way forwards. And similarly with the accountability pod, we facilitated the first one, but made it really clear to the leaders that they will be on their own for the subsequent pods. And actually, when you look at when I take a step back and I analyze things, like the advocacy for those experiences was really, really high, in terms of the way that people rated their experience and the specific things that they could list that they took away from them. And I agree. I think so much of that is about being with peers and realizing that, like, no one's got this nailed. Like, I feel uncomfortable, you feel uncomfortable, someone else might be 2 steps ahead of me, but they've experienced what I'm experiencing, and I think it really brought that up a notch as well.
Definitely. I mean, obviously, I was looking at that from an overall program perspective, but I experienced it personally and was going through the program myself. And for me, that's where those real moments of vulnerability came in. I think, being with a group for a period of time and a number of interactions, understanding you're all in the same context, they were the moments that really stick out for me when I think back to the program, the moments of true openness, vulnerability and sharing. And what came from that then is the real practical, I can give that a go, or and we've probably got bonds for life now through that experience for sure. Yeah.
And I've definitely got kind of some questions to bring us back around to, I guess, some of the things from your perspective that I guess proved that this was worth doing. One of the things that we were working together on really tightly at the start was how that we demonstrate evidence of impact for this. And I think for me at the time, I think it was a different approach. So we were essentially saying, okay, so this has been backed. This is something that's happening. There are some outcomes that that you're pinning to this. But do you remember that point where we started to work together on the hypothesis as well, in terms of, okay, what do we believe will be better / different as a result of this? And I think that gave us a really strong bedrock for being able to measure, because what we weren't doing, like, some way through the program, was chasing metrics or trying to attribute impact to things. We'd said, these are the things that we think will be different if we get this right, and if we are able to shift behavior in the right way and support people to apply. So we could build, like almost like build the dashboard, be watching those things and really attentive to it. Like I've kind of been quite vulnerable and said that was a different approach for us. And now when I advocate, whenever I'm starting a project with clients, like how did that kind of work out for you? And
Yeah, I mean, I think people are forever chasing the kind of, the unicorn that is kind of measuring impact and return in the learning space. And I think we did want to intentionally do something. And this is quite, I mean, as a combination of leadership and inclusion, they're quite tricky things to get hold of. I'm a little bit like you now, I think passionately from the work we did about really truly understanding the business problem and really understanding what would be different as a consequence of this, like what were the outcomes, and not just lofty kind of nebulous type of outcomes, but real specific things we would be able to observe and see our leaders doing differently, the impact they'd be having, the different moments that matter in the colleague experience life cycle. And then really early on, to your point, not thinking about that kind of months in, but actually starting to go, right, how do we baseline that now then? If that's what we want to see, how do we baseline it now? And then keep anchoring back to that. And I think that's been really key for us to flow that through. And it gives credibility to the program that it isn't just an academic exercise to learn about inclusion, but actually it is with tangible impact. We want to see leaders show up, behave, colleagues to have different experiences, customers to get different outcomes as a consequence, and that's been a thread that's ran through for us.
Yeah, and I owe massive credit here to the lead designer that was working with us on the program. So Carolyn Creed was involved in all of the thinking from the beginning. Once we mapped out what we knew that we needed to cover, and Carolyn introduced a principle really early in the design, which we were able to anchor to throughout the sessions, which was what we aren't asking leaders to do is to add to their to-do list. What we're asking them to really think about is how they show up. So they were working on their to-be list. And I remember being in many sessions, either observing or co-delivering. And someone's like that moment for leaders where it's like, what I can't offer up is the excuse of time because I can't find more time in my diary. Because what we were saying is, no. It's not about adding another item to the list of things that you struggle to get around to because people have big jobs. We're talking about how you show up in all of the moments that you show up in at the moment. And that was a big shift, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I said earlier, it's about like having a different lens on the way you lead. So it's not about something else you do. It's just shifting. It's, like putting your glasses on and suddenly the world is a different place, when you can see clearly. And I think that's what we did with this is we shared some ideas, some thinking, we created space for people to explore so that as they went back to leading their teams and leading their organizations, they saw the world through a different lens and made different choices and decisions about how they did that.
And I know we've already kind of touched upon the fact that what this couldn't be was a tick box. It wasn't about teaching people inclusion. So not a cerebral exercise, like a kind of to that point, like a being exercise. At what point did it start to feel different? Like, okay.
I mean, I think it was relatively early on. If I'm being really honest, Carl, I think, there are those early indicators, aren't they? This was a huge commitment. I mean, our most senior leaders at a incredibly busy time, and I think, but we saw a real commitment to it, and then a growing commitment to it, because I think, we got really great early sign up, but you always will, you'll have people who gravitate towards this naturally. I was on the first cohort, of course I was going to be kind of thing. And so, we saw early sign up to it. But then we saw a lot flowing out in terms of advocacy and word of mouth and continued commitment. This wasn't about us chasing people down and checking up on them. People were signing up and creating space in their calendars because they were having great experiences, ones that they valued, and therefore naturally they went. And there were really small stories where then we had people who had other commitments. This was like a 10-month long program, and so people inevitably have other commitments, but they're kind of going, can I move, can I switch, how can I catch up on it? That people were pulling it, and I think that's always a really great sign that they're getting value out of it if they're doing that. I think also things like we started to then see the pull for more resources. What can I do with my teams? How can I then take what I've learned and share it more broadly? And then we started to see the real stories about application of, and in the HR space, we started to get the requests from leaders who had shared with, and people had experienced it, and then could they share with it? And so I think all of those early indications before we even got to the measurement side of things in terms of how habits were shifting and impact it was having, we were seeing that advocacy and the engagement. So I think that very early on we knew that it was starting to have the impact, not because we were forcing it, driving compliance, but because people were pulling it. Yeah.
And I remember being in a session at that kind of tipping point where we'd moved beyond the initial set of cohorts that it had been opened up to, into it being open to more people, and someone saying that they'd signed up because of not because of their line manager had said, I think this would be good for you, but because of peers and colleagues were advocating for it and saying, I'm getting a ton from it, you should sign up too. I think that we'd always said at the beginning, hadn't we? It's like, this is never about pushing people into a program. This is about creating something that people want to be a part of. And then I think you get people turning up like ready to do the work to change.
Yeah, I mean, we know, the science tells us that there's always with something so important to the organisation, there's a real risk that you go down the compliance, this is mandated, this is compulsory, we absolutely want you to do this. We know from the science that has the absolute opposite effect to what you want to do, from how you choose to then engage with and respond to it. It doesn't work out well. And so I think with this, what we were always doing was why it was so important, creating the compelling reason why, creating the pull, and then the advocacy. And I think we saw that build, and we saw a greater level of personal investment in the learning from those people because they had chosen to invest their time, not just once, but constantly throughout it. And so, I think we proved that concept of when you create the compelling reason why, you create a greater commitment to personal learning and making a difference with it.
Nice. And you touched on something, you mentioned the word resources a little while ago. And it'd be good just to pick at that. So we hold this really firm, I guess, beliefs, and it morphs into a bit of a design principle for us, that what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't build things that you tell people they can access afterwards that have no relevance or context to the things that they've been exploring in a session. Otherwise, it's like, why would I bother checking that stuff out in a place that maybe I don't visit on a regular basis? But I remember we were like hell bent together on making sure that anything that we were asking someone to do, we then gave them a tangible, transferable way to be able to go and do something with that. So there were teach backs, there were resources to help people start to go and have brave conversations with their team, or to really tune into whether it was safe in the team. So not to look at, I guess, like company results when you think, or department results when you think about things like psychological safety. It's like, actually slow down and have those right conversations with your team members. How important were were those resources for leaders when it came to being able to take stuff and tangibly make a difference?
Oh, massively. Because I think, we've all been on workshops in the past, haven't we, where, you get a folder and then it sits on a shelf until eventually you kind of throw it away and never look
I've
at it
probably
again
still
and
still
stuff.
got some.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
And I think, we tested each other through that. Like we were really going like, look, people are really, really busy. Like this has to be super simple, super practical things that they can just like, have in a team meeting, and they're not trawling through like frameworks and principles, and it doesn't require an hour's prep to do a 15-minute activity
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so I think they became really important. And, to that piece of it's not extra, it was simple activities you could insert into your next one-to-one conversations or your next team meeting or and things like that. And I think that became, everyone talks about the transfer of learning or in the flow of work. And that was the important thing, that you don't leave it as that was a great conversation I had with a group of my peers.
Hmm.
But actually it becomes and that's where you got the, like my managers were experiencing different conversations. You were introducing new things that got them a little bit more curious. They then said, can I use that with my teams? It's that sort of viral
Yeah.
aspect of it. And I think having that practical thing that you can then share with people actually it just makes it easy for people. You want to remove any barriers. So super simple, super quick, really easy to access. Remove the barriers, make it happen, or
Yeah.
happen more often for sure.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that your team did a great job on is making sure that the pathway to find those things and access those things were frictionless. I also know that we spent a lot of time together working on how do we make sure that this feels really premium for people when we think about an experience. So I guess my lens would be that yes, this was leadership development for them to be able to develop, a muscle that they really needed to tune into, in order to help BT move forward into the future. But what we knew is that if it just turned up as learning, it wouldn't necessarily capture their attention in the same way. So I know that we, for example, thought, okay, so before someone's first session, like what's the engagement that's required? What should they be receiving? What little reminders should they have after a session? Like what's the one thing that we want to share with them as a key takeaway from the session? How do we nudge and signpost them? So there a lot of effort went into that. And I know that when we took a step back and looked at the kind of, I guess, the feedback from participants, they regularly cited the fact that this was more than just turning up to workshops. It was like they were immersed in stuff and they knew that they were moving through like a collection of experiences. What would you say to anybody that I guess kind of says, yeah, I can rationalize that as being something that you should invest in, but it sounds hard work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sometimes about repositioning it as the cost of not doing it.
Yeah.
And so I think, like I'm a huge fan of kind of looking at the end-to-end experience. And effectively, you start out with like 100 people. And then, I've probably been torture for you in terms of going, where do we potentially lose people along the way? And
Hmm.
then trying to kind of say, you put yourself in their shoes and you really test that experience and say, where could we end up losing people? And therefore, the investment we've made, we will lose if we
Yeah.
don't put those things in place. And I think, so yes, it is additional effort to do it. But I think effectively it secures your investment. It
Hmm.
mitigates the risk that you lose people along the way anyway. And that's definitely what we saw. We made it easy for the learners, not
Hmm.
necessarily for ourselves.
Yeah.
But we got the rewards for that. We got the continued participation. We got the great feedback. We made it effortless
Hmm.
on their part, and it meant they stuck with us throughout it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's absolutely worth it, and definitely the thing that you should be investing effort in energy into. I think there's quite rightly a lot of talk about how do you ensure that you market things effectively, and you absolutely need to do so, but you also need to manage the experience all of the way through. And I remember a conversation at one point where we were saying, okay, if you were going to a paid experience, like you were going to a concert or a gig, like what might the engagement feel like on the lead up, and which elements of that should we be replicating? And once you've been, what would they be sharing with you afterwards? What would be the sales effort to keep your engagement and your attention so that you're likely to maybe subscribe to something or pick a follow-up event? And I think that we got there with that.
Yeah, and I think people can often be, maybe people start listening or thinking like, oh, I can just see the effort, the cost loading into this,
Mhm.
and like that becomes a little bit. I think it's about being very intentional and really understanding from the learner's perspective, what are the moments that matter? So
Yeah.
you can come up with 100 different things, and of course you can massively over-engineer the experience, and quite honestly, people will not notice a lot of that. So I think it's about really understanding what those moments are, and engaging with people and talking to them about what are the points that you could lose them, and where's the friction in the experience. And then you can really target your efforts, and know with a high degree of, confidence that they're the ones that are going to make the difference, and that's what will have the impact. Yeah.
I guess the kind of the big question to ask is like, so did it work? Yeah, from your perspective, did we genuinely make a difference?
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, look, it goes right back to the start about what we were intending on doing. And I remember some of the early conversations about, if you go into this thinking you can shift all of the behaviors of all of the people all of the time, and you will have a group of people who will be all huge inclusion advocates, real allies, and this program is going to somehow do that. Like, you're being incredibly naive. So I think when we set about this, it was never going to be about getting to the end point. This was about getting it up on the radar of
Hmm.
all of our leaders, so that our leaders were more focused on this more of the time. And it built a solid foundation for all of the other work that we wanted to do in the inclusion space in our organization. So before we rushed in to talking about, performance calibration, and removing bias out of performance, or removing bias out of hiring, and all of that kind of thing. This was a solid foundation by which those conversations and those activities landed well, became a lot easier. There wasn't the
Hmm.
questioning about why is this important. And so I say we absolutely did that. We see all of those things, whether that is innovation in our customer products, or whether it is changing the colleague moments that matter in hiring and performance and talent. They land better because we've got a solid foundation for that now in the organization, like a really great jumping off point. And I think that's what we aimed to do for more of our leaders more of the time, and we've done that for sure.
Yeah, I certainly look back at for me professionally, as this is one of those big moments where you know that you've been involved in a program that's driven significant change and genuinely impacts people. And it's not just the people that are going through the program, it's all of the people that feel the ripple of their change, and I kind of, so yeah,
Yeah.
definitely an immense sense of pride. Final question, I guess it's a little bit of a reflection. So what would your message be to anybody that's thinking about doing this, or if not this, like something similar, but is holding back, and maybe hasn't got over the line on making the decision to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to your outcomes. I think, you know, getting really, really clear about the business problem, the value to the business, the value to your customers, your value to your colleagues. And I think when you start to really dig into that, you kind of almost convince yourself because you've got such a compelling reason. And I think, if we are all operating within constraints, like everyone has constraints. And so what I'd say is if there are constraints, then test and learn, like pick a small group, prove the concept, understand the impact and the results to give you the confidence to then go on to start to scale it in the organization. But make the first step, be brave enough to kind of, even if that is a small first step. And I'm convinced, if you're clear about your outcomes, I'd have confidence every time that there's a really great experience there, and you'll prove that concept and then figure your way out from that and feel more confident scaling it.
I think that's great advice, Lisa. I think be clear on what it is that you're trying to do, know how you're going to measure it, and start doing something. So take those first steps, even if it's starting small, in order to build to the thing that you want to do. I've really enjoyed this. It's felt lovely to be able to look back on something that's, I know that we've both personally invested a lot of time, effort, and energy into, and there are a bunch of people. I mean, we couldn't even begin to credit the number of people that have been involved. So for anybody listening to this that was involved in this, just a massive thank you. I know that kind of it's the collective effort that's ended up with something that's you can feel really, really proud about. So huge thank you for your time today. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to catching up soon.